Welcome back to the channel, folks, and in this video I'm going to go through my recommended VR settings and tips, which I'm glad to say is a lot easier than it used to be. In the past I've had to do at least a 35-40 minute video, or maybe even up to an hour, talking about different config files, going into, the actual core sim to change all sorts of code and God knows what. But nowadays, it is so much easier to get decent VR performance, and that's simply because the sim has matured. So in this video, I'm going to give you some of my top tips and some sort of baseline settings for various PC systems, and hopefully it'll give you a bit of a starting point to get your sim the way it should be running for 2026. So let's start by going into the VR graphics settings. Go to VR, go to VR graphics, and that's all of our stuff here. By the way, if you can hear a baby in the background, that's William saying hi. So let's start off with a few things here. Maybe talk about some heavy hitters, I like to call them. These are the kind of things that may induce stutters and really affect your FPS. Talking of FPS, by the way, you can check that by going to General, Advanced Options, then Developer Mode, and at the top tab here, down the debug section and to rendering, display FPS. That is a really great tool because it gives you all sorts of information about your main thread, as well as your VRAM, system RAM, your download speed, rolling cache. Lots of information here, very useful, just to fine tune your settings. Let's talk about, first of all, anti-aliasing. Now, ideally, you want to be running in TAA mode because that is the native rendering pipeline, and that will give you the full fat sort of sharpness, goodness of the sim. But things have now changed quite a bit with DLSS 4, and in some cases, actually, DLSS 4 is sharper than TAA mode, especially when looking at scenery down low and also steam gauges. So I would recommend, folks, that if the type of flying you're doing is bush flying, VFR types of flying, then stick with DLSS, and balance mode is a very nice combination. I do feel performance is also quite useful as well, but I think balanced is definitely the option that I prefer to go to. I think quality is going a bit too far, and you start to not really benefit from those extra performance from upscaling the native image in DLSS 4. Now, sticking with DLSS 4, thankfully Sboy now implement this native to the sim, but I would recommend when updating your Nvidia drivers, or maybe when the sim updates itself, to head over to the DLSS swapper. I'll have a link in the description below of where to find it. This tool is invaluable, not just to Microsoft Flight Simulator, but also any other application as well. It's very easy. All you do is click on the particular program you want to change, and here we're running the 310.1. Now that's really old now, and what we can do is update to 310.4. In some cases, this will give you better performance, but also better image quality as well, because you may get less ghosting as the DLSS versions start to improve, and they are getting better, I must admit. Still not perfect though, and I personally prefer TAA mode when I'm really looking at glass cockpits or I need that sharpness, with those gauges. But anything else, any other type of flying, I still use DLSS 4. So in this case, just download it. And swap, so it does it all for you now. This is a much better utility than it used to be. I mean, it's always been fantastic, but now it's absolutely brilliant. So we'll now swap. We're now running the latest DLSS, and you can even change the preset. Now these are different sort of algorithms on how the upscaling is performed, and it's transformer mode that we want here, and I do recommend either preset J or K. I personally find preset J to give you a bit better performance but more ghosting. Preset K is a bit crispier, especially when you're looking at the airspeed tape, or a moving GPS. There'll be a little bit less ghosting, but it's still there, folks. You're never going to get rid of it completely. In terms of frame generation, well, that's useful if you're running 2D mode, so I would recommend still getting the latest version there, and it's as simple as downloading it and swapping it. But obviously for VR, frame generation isn't really any good. So now we've got the latest version of DLSS 4. In this case, I would recommend obviously just restarting the sim before going flying. Now let's talk about the big one, foveated rendering. This is a huge deal now for VR, and it's highly recommended. Whether you have a VR headset that does not have eye tracking, that's fine, because you can use fixed foveated rendering. And what it essentially means is it's a certain area of your vision which you can change using the scaling slider to enable you to have the highest image quality. So with a fixed foveated rendering, you'd get bars either side and they would be fixed. With eye tracking, you can bring that right in to 35, even 30. And what that does with eye tracking enabled is render a much smaller region for you to look through, and it will follow your eyes. It's amazing, really, and it's great tech, and it finally is native into the sim. And it will give you a lot better performance. The only thing though is with eye track foveated rendering, funny enough, it does cost some CPU resources as well, so you do need a decent CPU for this to work correctly. But eye-tracked foveated rendering, or dynamic foveated rendering, I've done loads of videos in the past, and it is a very cool tool. But I'm really glad that if you don't have that, say you've got a Quest 3, you can still enjoy fixed foveated rendering, which still gives you about 12 frames per second back. Now, to put that into context, that's almost a difference between a 4090 and 5090 in VR. Okay, so that's a pretty decent amount of frames back. Let's now talk about the max frame rate, which is really important, and especially for VR, because it's pretty much impossible to get the full native frames per second of the refresh rate of your headset. For example, a Quest 3 running at 80 Hz, you'd ideally need 80 frames per second in order to get really smooth performance. A lot of VR headsets are more like 90 Hz. Again, it's just so difficult to get 90 frames per second in VR unless you have a 5090, and even then it's a bit of a struggle, especially if you're looking at high resolution VR. But the great thing, thankfully, about this is you don't need to run the native frames per second in a flight sim. It's a bit different if you're enjoying a fast-paced first-person shooter, but for general aviation flying, airliner flying, and maybe even a bit of fighter jet flying, you know, even down low, you can get away with half of the frame rate of your refresh rate of your headset. So basically what that means is for example, a 90 Hz refresh rate, well, all you ideally need is, if I look at the right thing, 45 frames per second. Or perhaps say you're happy with 80 Hz, well then you only need 40 frames per second. And this ensures there's less screen tearing and better frame timing, and giving your PC more resources back to do other things like flight modeling and weather physics and all these fancy graphics options. This is something that people say in my comments all the time. Oh, Steve, this is crap. You're only getting 45 frames per second. And yes, I actually lock it to 45 on purpose. I could get probably 50, maybe 60 frames per second, but I prefer to be at half of my refresh rate in terms of the FPS numbers, because I find that works really well. Now, in terms of reprojection mode, I'm not a fan of this in the sim. I always leave that off. And if you're not sure what that is, it's adding fake frames in order to give you a perceived 90 frames or native frames per second into the headset. A bit like frame generation, but it's VR's version. And at the moment, there's not many headsets that do it very well. The Quest 3 does it really well, the Meganex does, and anything with virtual desktop runs really well as well. Unfortunately, the Pimax headsets have pretty awful motion reprojection at the time of recording. They call it smart smoothing. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend motion reprojection in Pimax Play, because it just simply does not work at the moment. So you could do it this way, max frame rate. You could also do it within the VR headset software. For example, in Pimax Play here, if we go to device settings, and actually, unfortunately, this is going to change with Pimax Play version 2, but the same things apply, and that is down here, lock to half refresh rate. That is something that is a feature with Pimax Play, and in some cases other VR headsets as well. So let's now go down to a few other things, because as I say, I did do a video explaining all of these settings a while ago, and I will link that in the description below. I'm just going to go through a few heavy hitters, then I'm going to give you a baseline recommended settings, and then I'm going to go through Pimax Play a bit more, some of my Nvidia driver settings, and that's basically it these days, folks. It's so much easier than it used to be. So, terrain level of detail. This is an interesting one because this is twofold. Not only does it obviously control the amount of trees and buildings you see in the far distance, but it also is linked to the ortho imagery. And sometimes, if this setting is too low, the ortho imagery will start to blur and become a lot less defined. So I would recommend a bare minimum of about 120, even for a low spec computer. But really, ideally, you want this at 150 or above. For me, with a 5090, with this particular system, I run it at nearly 300, and to be honest, it works absolutely fine. Doesn't have too much of an impact thanks to the CPU. This is a CPU thing, this, as well as object level of detail. Notice I've got that on 200, but again, I wouldn't recommend anything less than 100, otherwise you'll really start to see things popping in. I mean, they do anyway, even on quite high settings, but ideally the sweet spot for that is between 100 and 150. But if you really want to go crazy, then go for 200. So other things that are heavy hitters, trees are still an area where you just need to be very careful, and thankfully at Sboy, well, this sim does like trees. You know, there's a lot of trees in this sim, so you don't have to worry about having them. Even on low settings, you'll still have plenty of trees, and it really will help increase your FPS and smoothness. Volumetric clouds, again, this is a heavy hitter between high and ultra. There is quite a difference though in terms of the visual fidelity now. Ultra seems to have had an upgrade now, and the clouds do look a lot better. But to be fair, you are looking at least 5 frames per second in some cases in VR. So either stick that to high, and if you really are struggling, then medium. But be warned, you know, unfortunately between medium and high, there is a big difference in visual fidelity. Texture resolution, that is a VRAM thing. So of course, if you've got a really decent graphics card with lots of VRAM, you're okay. But just keep an eye on this, and I would recommend actually when changing some of these settings, just have this FPS in mind. And if you want to look at it in VR, then I would recommend the OpenXR toolkit just for the FPS counter, because you can see it in VR using OpenXR runtimes, which is very useful. But in each case, change just a couple of these settings and then go for a flight. I know it's a bit tedious, but once you've got a decent sort of baseline setting, I always say this, folks, I always say this, go to London City, heavy cloud. That is the stress test scenario. If you can get 30 frames per second there, you are good to go most places in the sim. I'd also recommend New York and maybe Geneva. My good friend Uwe has recommended that because it has anywhere basically where you've got lakes and photogrammetry and a heavy busy airport. That's the 3 things that are going to kill your FPS. So in most cases, really, even high, you're not going to notice a massive difference in texture resolution, and I would recommend keeping this on high actually, unless you've got a very powerful GPU. AF filtering, in my opinion, isn't something that's really hard on GPUs these days, and even with a 4070 you can easily run this on 8 times or 16 times, so that's not an issue there. So another thing is ray march reflections. If you've got a 50 series card, I'm talking 5070, 5080, then ray march reflections actually run really well. I have found though that on 40 series cards this still can hit pretty hard, so just take that off, folks. It's not worth it. And light shafts is another thing as well that can hit performance quite hard, I've found, on lower end GPUs. Now things of course like airport service, quantity and variety, these are things that it depends how important it is for you. For me, I like variety, but I don't like too many of them. So I prefer lots of different types of aircraft, but only a few at my airport, wherever I am. That is a nice balance there, because each flight tends to be a lot different, because sometimes I can be at an airport and I'll see a really unusual looking airliner or an unusual livery, a very strange looking GA aircraft, but I won't see too many of them, so it won't affect performance too much. Road traffic, that's a CPU thing, as well as fauna. Now, I don't really see that many animals these days. I think they have scaled that back. But again, it all depends on how important these settings are to you. But all these here are very much about your CPU. And, something like a 11, 12, 1300K, 1400K, and a 7800 X3D or 9800 X3D, you're going to be absolutely fine having these on at least, high or medium, in my opinion. Absolutely fine. So another thing I want to mention before we move on, I'll show you basically a range of different settings that I recommend personally as baseline settings for your sim moving forward, is this, the dynamic settings. This is something that does work a lot better now, and in tandem with your lock to half of the refresh rate. So let's say we put this back down to 45 frames per second and also keep our dynamic settings to 45. That works really well, but the only thing about this is Sboy's sort of implementation of dynamic settings is still quite rudimentary. You're only going to really have a few things that are going to be adjusted automatically to try and keep to that target FPS. That's mainly the terrain level of detail and object level of detail. This is where I think Auto FPS is still a very good tool, and I would still recommend it because you can change a whole variety of parameters, including the cloud rendering and certain levels of detail depending on altitude and that kind of thing. You could even try running these together, which I have heard is actually quite useful in my Discord, and some people find that really good. The only thing is it will take a bit of setting up. I personally don't really use Auto FPS these days because I think this is probably enough for you. It does work really well, but again, it's all about that balance and getting to a place where you are confident that you can achieve 30 frames per second minimum, no lower. And for that, again, I will say go to London City or New York or Geneva and maybe fly an airliner or one of your high fidelity aircraft and see how you get on there. So yeah, I will reiterate again that DLSS 4 is huge now, and a lot of the time I am running DLSS 4 even with my 5090 computer because it can look sharper, especially the scenery and Steam gauges. But unfortunately Sboy have not yet implemented a mask to enable glass cockpits to have a TAA window. So for that I often use TAA. Let's now quickly talk about the rendering scale. In my opinion, and this is all it is, folks, I'm no expert. People think I am, but I really am not. Please check out other YouTubers as well. But I must say, I think some of them are getting a bit too silly with the settings. You don't need to go so crazy with it these days. Keep swapping Nvidia drivers and changing config files. I mean, you can do that, but I've tried all of the settings and hacks out there, and I find these days they don't make the difference they used to simply because the sim is better optimized now. But in terms of your render scaling, always keep this to 100% and change the resolution scaling in the headset software. So again, I'm going back to the Pimax here. This is important, and again, I'll go through this, what I recommend for certain GPUs. But image quality, and sorry, this is going to look a little different with Pimax Play 2, but things are changing all the time. You could leave that on auto. This is actually quite a good system now from Pimax, that they have different presets dialed in depending on your GPU. If you have a 5090, this will actually, whoops, that's the wrong one, sorry. This will actually upscale it a little bit to 1.110 with the micro OLED, for instance. But I would recommend for anything other than that to either run on high, say for a 5080, 5090, but ideally you want to be backing that off to about 75%. If we do that here with medium, you'll notice it does that anyway. So these presets from Pimax are pretty decent. In terms of Steam VR, I'll just show you where that is now. Oh, by the way, while I'm here, let's go through a couple of other things as well. I prefer 90 Hertz, but it depends really on your own eyes. 72 Hertz with the micro OLED is actually doable. In terms of the Pimax Crystal Light, I think you've got 75 Hertz, or is it 72? I can't remember. But again, have a play around with your refresh rate. The lower you can go, the more headroom you have with your VR settings. But of course, it might be a bit uncomfortable to you, because bear in mind, lower refresh rates means that you could actually feel a little bit more nauseous, and you could see some strobing in the headset. Also, make sure you've got your OpenXR runtime set to Pimax XR, especially for Pimax headsets. You don't need to use SteamVR at all. In terms of image sharpening, I don't really use a lot of that, but in the past I have messed around. No more than about 0.4, because I have tried 0.6 to 0.8. It starts to look a bit synthetic. So a little bit of sharpening goes a long way, but don't go too crazy with it. GPU upscaling, I personally don't recommend this at all in the Pimax Play. You're better off using it in the sim. It's far better. Make sure quad views is off, by the way, as well. You don't need that. All you need to make sure is that eye tracking is enabled if you have it on your VR headset. Make sure that's enabled, and then you will automatically get dynamic foveated rendering, because the sim does pick that up. Make sure quad views is set to off, okay? And again, make sure smart smoothing is off, because it doesn't really work very well. Come on, Pimax, let's get this sorted, because it used to work really well. Right then, let's say you've got a different headset. The first thing you need to do is go to settings, make sure that the correct runtime is set. So in this case, SteamVR set as OpenXR runtime. Also, go to video, in this case, go to custom, and then you can set your render resolution here. Obviously, that's extremely high. But that's basically the rendering target for the micro OLED, and you can see here it's insane, really. Even for a 5090, that is hard to run. So I would recommend backing that off, even with a 5090, to somewhere around 5.5, somewhere around there. Have a play around, folks. There's no golden setting here. Just have a play around with your system, but again, make sure to restart the sim and SteamVR when you change this resolution scaling. Now, for other SteamVR based headsets such as the Bigscreen Beyond and MegaNex, particularly the MegaNex, so motion smoothing works really well with that headset. It's really very, very smooth. You can also change your refresh rate as well here with the MegaNex. Very, very cool. And I definitely would recommend for the MegaNex is to download Sboy 3's wonderful application that can change all manner of settings, including the distortion profile, the field of view. There's so much stuff here which really makes the MegaNex shine. And this is what I'm using currently, my settings for the MegaNex. I'd also recommend that you switch on hardware accelerated GPU scheduling. If you type in GPU into your search bar, enable that and restart your computer. Now, this is particularly important if you find that when moving your head you get quite a lot of stuttering and it's very uncomfortable. It could be due to GPU scheduling being turned on or off. You might need to experiment with that, but that could be the source of all your problems when moving your head around. Some GPU and CPU configurations mean that you need that on. Some mean you need it off, in which case I'd recommend just having a play around. Now for my Nvidia driver settings, and I know some people out there go absolutely mental with this. I have tried all of them, folks, and don't find that any of them make a big difference apart from maybe one or two, and that is power management mode. I prefer that at maximum performance, and also texture resolution, I leave that on performance as well. That is it, folks. That's all I do. And in terms of your taskbar, look at all this crap I've got running in here. When you're starting the sim, make sure most of this stuff that you don't need, such as Revive dashboard, Microsoft Teams, MegaNex software, don't need that running, Discord, Steam, all that is off, especially this one, the Nvidia settings. Ironically, this one can cause stutters. Make sure you get rid of all this stuff and only run the things outside the sim that are important to your simming session. Now, in terms of your virus protection software and malware protection, I personally really recommend Malwarebytes. I've used it for well over 10-15 years. I'm not sponsored by them or anything like that, but I will say in all the time I've used it, it's never let me down. I've never even bothered to really mess around with the settings. It just does what it says on the tin, quite honestly, and it runs in the background and never gives me any aggro. So I would recommend that, but maybe with your virus program software, maybe just exclude the MSFS folder because it might limit all those scans taking place, especially when you're on short finals to land. That can be very irritating. But now I'm going to show you what I use for a 4070 Super base system running a 13700F base CPU. And this is what I'm using with a 13900K running a 4090. And finally, this is what I use with the 5090, and you've already seen it, but yeah, this is basically what I use. And as I say, before anyone comments below, yes, I can run VR on Ultra with a 5090. Yes, I absolutely can. It's a bit of a beast of a PC, but I still wouldn't recommend doing it because smoothness is way more important than a few extra puffy clouds. So let's now talk about the Quest 3. My personal favourite way of using it is virtual desktop, and my preferred codec is the AV1 10-bit codec. It is a little bit more hefty on frame rate, so if that's too much for you, you can always try the other ones. And if you have issues as well, because it can sometimes cause issues with certain GPUs, but for me, AV1 10-bit for all of my GPUs. And of course I run VDXR, which is the OpenXR integration of virtual desktop. It is superb, folks. It is brilliant. And here now I'll just show you what my settings are in the virtual desktop app. I use godlike mode with the 4070S as well as the 4090 and 5090. And these are my settings which run really well. I do personally like the Snapdragon upscaling. For me, it just gives me a little bit more sharpness. Some people don't like it. They find it's a bit shimmery. That's fine, but have a play around with it, folks. Like I say, this is not the holy grail of VR settings. It's just what I do. That's all it is. It's just what I do, folks. There is also a new option in virtual desktop where you can take the field of view back a little bit, which is very cool, and it does make a difference, and in some cases can make the Quest 3 a little bit sharper because it's kind of squishing it, you know, into a more sort of smaller picture. So I wouldn't recommend going too crazy with this, otherwise you'll get black lines, but it does make a difference to performance. It's a very welcome addition. And in terms of refresh rate, I would recommend using 80 Hz at 40 frames per second, either using SSW, which is their motion reprojection technique, which I would highly recommend because it is absolutely stunning. And sometimes I'll actually pick the Quest 3 over any other VR headset when I'm doing sort of sightseeing tours because it is so smooth. You could also, though, if you're not going to use SSW, feel free to use a locked 45 frames per second, say at 90 Hz as well. If you'd like me to do a separate Quest 3 link settings, then I will do as a separate video. I don't tend to use link that much because virtual desktop is so amazing and it works so well. But I will say I do use the Oculus debug tool and turn the bit rate right up really very high, and it does look sharper admittedly, but I don't know, I just feel like it's more stable with virtual desktop, and of course you don't have any wires either, and the Quest 3 for me is all about being wireless. You know, it's a fantastic headset for that. And that's it, folks. That's all I do these days. A lot simpler than it used to be. Now of course I know I've only shown mainly the Pimax headsets and the Quest 3 and some Steam VR things such for the Meganex and Bigscreen Beyond, There are other headsets out there that I haven't mentioned, such as the Varia Aero. I know I used to do a settings guide for that, so let me know if you're interested. Also the Play for Dream with its transport streaming technology. That's something that if you want to get that up and running, there is a full guide in my Discord, but soon it's going to get a lot easier. And when that happens, I'll post that and show you how all that works as well. But for now, folks, thank you so much for watching. I hope it's been useful in some way. And all that's left for me to say is Happy New Year, and I'll see you again very soon. Take care and bye for now.